So as I was saying, for me, the most important thing about a job interview is to prepare it. When you're at school and you have a physics exam, you do your homework, you learn your formulae, you prepare for the exam. So why would a job interview be any different? Especially in today's world of internet, access to just about any information about anything. Before you have your job interview, look up the company's website, look them up on internet, find out about their history, their activities, their products, their offices, and also if you know who your interviewer is going to be, and 9 times out of 10 you will know, then look them up on social media, in particular LinkedIn. Find out what their background is, find out maybe their academic background, find out about their hobbies, and that can give you invaluable information to differentiate yourself from other candidates. And just one very simple example, if you go onto the Norman Alex website, in my profile, you'll see that I'm a football fan and I support Manchester City. And I once interviewed somebody for Norman Alex and he said, "Oh, I see you're a City fan. They're my favorite team as well." And it's a very minor detail, but it makes me feel warmer towards that candidate. That's a very trivial example, but I think if you know what university the person went to, and maybe you went to the same university, it's going to create a bond. If the person worked at the same company as you 15 years ago, it's going to give you something to talk about. So, rule number one for me, prepare the interview. So rule number two for me is make a strong impression. And you have literally 5 to 10 seconds to make that impression. And a job interview is like any other context. When you meet someone socially, when you meet someone in a supermarket, in any walk of life, you're going to create a pretty strong impression about that person very quickly. And you're going to decide whether you like the person, whether you don't like the person, whether you want to spend more time speaking with them. And maybe you can be wrong, but 9 times out of 10, that first impression, that instinct you have when you meet someone is actually correct. And in a job interview, it's exactly the same. And it goes back to hundreds of thousands of years ago when we were living in Africa on the savannah, and you come across another predator, another tribe, and your life depends on making the right decision within those first seconds. Should you fight or should you go for flight? And the job interview, hundreds of thousands of years later, is just another example of fight and flight and making the right decision very quickly. So make sure that you dress properly. It's better to be overdressed than too casual. Make sure if it's a physical interview that your fingernails are clean, that your shoes have been cleaned properly. And then when you actually meet the person, don't just wait for the person to take the initiative in a very passive way. Be active, stand up, greet the person, offer your hand, shake the person's hand firmly, and thank the person for actually interviewing you. And they will really appreciate that. And obviously, in today's world, a lot of interviews, especially the first interview, will be done on Zoom or Teams or by video. But the same principles apply when you're doing a video call. You've got 5, 10 seconds to make a positive first impression. So don't forget, the first impression is the most important impression. Be positive. The third rule for me is to stress your achievements. All too often, I'll be interviewing candidates. I'll ask them to tell me about their career, to talk me through their CV, and they would just tell me about their day-to-day responsibilities. They'll just go through their job description, but it doesn't really tell me very much about the value that they've added to their jobs. So before you have a job interview, go through your CV, think very hard about your career, the various jobs you've had, and try to come up with a short list of real added value that you brought to your company, real achievements that you can be proud of. For example, if you're a finance director, don't tell the interviewer about how you draw up the budgets, about the monthly reporting, about day-to-day cash management. The interviewer wants to know, how have you increased the profitability of the company? How have you reduced the costs of the company? How have you worked with senior management to improve the processes? That's what's important. If you're a salesperson, the interviewer wants to know, did you meet your sales targets? Did you exceed your sales targets? It's really important to go through your career and really prepare the interview so that you can show the added value that you brought to your previous employers. Because the interviewer is looking for someone to do the same thing for his or her company. They're looking for someone who can make a difference. And if you can't stress your achievements, then you won't differentiate yourself from other candidates and you won't get the job. And if you go through your career before the interview, as I suggest, and you can't think of any achievements that you've done, you can't think of any added value that you brought to your company, then that's probably another conversation that you're going to have with yourself. And maybe it's not the right time to move. Maybe it's time to stay in your current position and try and work harder, more proactively, so that you can actually achieve something that you're proud of and that will help you leverage your career in the future. So rule number 4 for me is to be enthusiastic and to be concise. If one of my clients is hesitating between two candidates, my advice will always be to make the offer to the candidate who's more enthusiastic and who's more motivated. And positivity and enthusiasm are contagious. And if you can be enthusiastic when you talk, if you can be positive, then it's going to make the potential employer, feel positively about you. Obviously, you never want to criticize your previous employers. You never want to be negative about people. But if you can be positive, positivity is contagious and you reap what you sow. And that's going to differentiate you from so many of the other candidates that the interviewer will be meeting during that day. Because don't forget that very often an interviewer might have 8 or 10 interviews in a day, and it can be very tiring. And I know what I'm talking about because I've been doing this for a very, very long time. And similarly, be concise, be precise, and be incisive. Unfortunately, the interview process can be quite stressful, and when people are stressed, they might have the tendency to talk too much and not to be concise enough. And if you can maybe practice before the interview, do some recordings, and learn how to present your career in a positive way and in a very concise way, that's going to wake the interviewer out of his or her stupor. And it's going to make them remember you, and it's going to make you different from most of the other people that the interviewer will have met during that day. So we've already talked about the importance of preparing the interview, of finding out about the company before you actually meet the person. And similarly, I think you have to prepare answers that might come up during the interview regarding potential weaknesses in your career, in your CV. For example, somebody who has moved around a lot, changed jobs every 2 years, has to think of a good reason why they've done that, has to justify it during the interview if the question comes up, as it probably will. Somebody who's been unemployed for the last 12 months. Why have you been unemployed? Why haven't you found a job? Or why haven't you been looking for a job? You have to think up a good reason to justify this before you go for the interview. And everybody has weaknesses in their career. It wouldn't be human otherwise. And I would recommend very strongly that you go through your CV, ideally with a third party, with a friend, your partner, maybe a colleague who knows that you're looking for another position, and try and sort out the potential weaknesses and the potential questions that could come up where you have to justify with a pertinent answer. But bear in mind that if you're actually having the interview, it's because your strengths almost certainly outweigh the weaknesses. Otherwise, you wouldn't be summoned for the interview. So you have to think about your weaknesses in the positive light, as it were. And prepare also for certain standard questions that often come up during an interview that you can probably find on internet. What's your main weakness? What are your main strengths? Why should we recruit you for this position? These are questions that come up all too often, and with a little bit of homework, you can prepare for them. But my favorite question, and one which I think you should think about before any interview, is what is the most difficult thing that you've done in your career or in your personal life? And as is always the case, it's not the question, but the answer that's the most revealing. And sometimes I will have a candidate who will say, I reduced the deadline for the management reports by 2 days. But try and think of something a bit more original. For example, a candidate I interviewed a few years ago told me, well, probably the most difficult thing that I've done, I broke my back in a skiing accident, and 12 months later, I climbed to the peak of Everest. And I can assure you that if you have an answer like that, you're going to stand out from all or most of the other candidates. So we've looked at the importance of preparing the interview, of checking up on the company, potentially checking up on the person who's going to interview you, but also, and maybe as part of that process, prepare some intelligent questions that you can ask during the interview, or ideally keep some of them for the end of the interview. When I interview someone for Ivor Alex, I always finish the interview, as most interviewers do, with the question, do you have any questions? And the worst possible answer is no, or no, not really, I think it's all clear. If you don't have any questions at the end of the interview, at best, it shows a lack of curiosity, but at worst, it shows a lack of motivation. And assuming that you are motivated for the position, of course, you really need to prepare some specific questions. Those questions can, for example, relate to the financial statements, assuming that you've read them, which of course you should have done. Why did your profits fall by 15% last year? Or why did your operating costs increase by 20%? But they could be perhaps more general questions, such as, can you describe the corporate culture? And a question I particularly like, can you give me an example of somebody you've recruited recently who's turned out to be very successful, and maybe explain why they've been successful? Or perhaps even more revealingly, can you give me an example of someone you've recruited recently that hasn't worked out, and maybe explain why that person has failed in your company? And I think as well as getting interesting information that will enable you to find out if the position is a good match for you and if the company corresponds to your own ethics, it will show the interviewer that you've prepared the process and that you've really thought about the interview. So the last piece of advice I would give you, assuming obviously that you are interested in the job, it's to ask for the job. Finish the interview on a positive note. Everybody likes to be liked. Everybody appreciates being appreciated. And interviewers are no different from anybody else. And they'll really appreciate it if you show that you're motivated by saying, well, I really hope that I'll get the opportunity to proceed to the next stage. Or if it's a final interview, I'd just like to let you know that I really like your company and I'm really interested by the position. And I would love to have the opportunity of working with you. Obviously, if the interviewer feels that you're not the right candidate, they're not going to make you an offer just because you want the job. But if they're hesitating between you and someone else, then maybe it will sway things in your favor. And similarly, if you want the job, but even if you don't, send a thank you letter afterwards. Now, in today's world, it's probably more likely to be a thank you email, but it's a sign of politeness, first of all. You go to somebody for dinner, you send them a message to thank them for the dinner, and a job interview is exactly the same. So send an email afterwards to thank them for the interview, and if you are interested by the position, to state that you're interested by the position and that you would love to have the opportunity to meet the company again. But what I would really recommend, if you want to differentiate yourself, is not to send an email, but to send a handwritten letter. This is very unusual in today's world. It takes more time, it takes more effort, but believe me, this year I might have got 1,000 New Year messages by email, and I only got one actual handwritten card delivered to the office. And that's the one that has stuck out in my mind and that I appreciate the most. So think about that. If you have the time, send a handwritten thank you letter, either by ordinary mail, or if you live nearby, actually drop it into the office yourself. And that can make all the difference between not getting the job and finding the job of your dreams.